presentation for everybody. Latin America's growing LNG market. I loved Kenna's presentations. I was taking screenshots and dropping down notes. But this is a broader macro view of the market, supply and demand, and more importantly, prices, which is one of Poten and Partner specialties. So for those of you who may not be familiar, I'm a senior LNG analyst for the Americas, Alaska to Argentina for Poten and Partners. Who is Poten and Partners? We started as a ship brokering firm about 80 years ago, but now we've branched out into consulting. I work for the business intelligence division, which is we produce these publications regarding the LNG industry. We do kind of a local industry wrap up on a monthly basis. We do a quarterly publication about contracts and contract pricing. We do a short-term forecast, it's 2 years. We do a 10-year long-term supply and demand forecast. But guess what? This hasn't been announced publicly yet, but Poten and Partners, starting with our next issue of Global LNG Outlook, we are switching to a 20-year forecast. So you can look forward to a 20-year forecast for supply and demand globally in each country around the world, starting with our very next issue of Global LNG Outlook. I'm just going to run through the agenda today. Just going to give you all a brief market introduction for Latin America. Then we'll talk about imports. We'll talk about exports. We'll talk about how the LNG market in Latin America is evolving. And then we'll just wrap it up with some final thoughts. Just market introduction. Those of you who've been to the GNL Forum conferences have seen this slide. For us at Poten and Partners, we're defining Latin America as everything south of the United States. And that's a region of 665 million people, rather large market. But, it's a market where supplies of natural gas are far away from demand centers. There's things like mountains, jungles, swamps, oceans, things separating the markets from where the gas is. And not only that, you see varying amounts of power demand in the countries. The average American consumes 100 times more electricity than the average person in Haiti. So you see kind of wide variability across all the nations there. One of the things we do here at Poten is that we track different nations and different projects. Their liquefaction versus regasification capacity. And so liquefaction capacity is the ability to produce and export LNG. Regasification is the ability to import and regasify it and get it to market. If you look right here, you'll see that in Latin, this is for Latin America, there is nearly more than 4 times the regasification capacity than liquefaction capacity. That liquefaction capacity over time will increase in Latin America, but overall, we expect Latin America to remain a net LNG importer. That can change in some years, however, when exports can exceed imports, when there are less imports, like let's say in a non-drought year, they'll import less than they export. But we'll get into that later. Overall, though, just because they have the capacity doesn't mean that they're importing that every day at those volumes, or they're producing at those volumes when we're talking about liquefaction capacity. Just wanted to give you all an idea of how Latin America fits into the global LNG markets. This slide looks at liquefaction capacity, the ability to make, produce, and export LNG. Right now, there's about 472 MTPA of liquefaction capacity globally. A lot of that, most of that, a good chunk of it, as you can see here in the dark blue, comes from the Asia Pacific region, which includes Qatar, in Middle Eastern producers like that, Australia. I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry. Let me rewind the tape. APAC includes Australia. We have the Middle East here, which includes Qatar, and then you see the United States, which started from zero and then began exports in 2016, and then grew into the largest LNG exporter in the world. You see here Africa, Europe, and you see Latin America. Right now, as a region, Latin America is in last place in terms of liquefaction capacity, but over time, it could potentially overtake Europe as an LNG exporter region. So that's liquefaction capacity. We're looking at global regasification capacity. That's the ability to import and distribute LNG. You see right now close to 1,200 MTPA of global capacity. Asia Pacific as a region takes more than half of that capacity. We've seen Europe grow its capacity, but we expect it to reach a peak by the end of the decade and just plateau and then slightly decline over time. You see this dark blue for North America. I know that the United States is the world's largest LNG exporter, but a lot of the plants retain the ability to import LNG as needed. You see that in places like Cove Point, Elba Island, et cetera, where they still have the ability and the permits to import LNG when needed, and they do that on an occasional basis. Then you see, regasification capacity. You see Latin America right here, and then you see the Middle East, and then other regions like Sub-Saharan Africa and everything. Overall, we expect we'll get into imports in a second. Right here, yeah. Kenna mentioned earlier the LNG importers in Latin America. Right now, there's about a dozen LNG importers around Latin America. You can see right here, this is just regasification capacity. This is not what they actually import. You see that Brazil is the largest LNG importer, has the largest regas capacity. Over time, though, we just see it's like the build out is pretty much largely complete. There's much more capacity than they import, and they have geographic diversity all along the coast of Brazil, covering all the important regions of the nation. You see over time how Mexico had all this regasification import capacity, but with the construction of cross-border pipelines, there's less need to use the LNG import terminals in Mexico. So you see that declining over time with just one or two import terminals remaining open. You see the Dominican Republic, you see Argentina as its regas capacity is growing as shrinking over time and going to zero as that nation becomes a net LNG exporter. Oops. Okay, so one of the things we track here at Poten is that, again, that regasification capacity versus the actual demand. And so you see in the blue, that's regasification capacity across the region, across Latin America. But then in the orange there at the bottom, that's what they actually import or what they're forecasted to import. And you see during drought years like the El Nino years, you see imports increase, and then as rainfall returns, they drop off. This is a pattern we've seen in Latin America over the past decade, and we expect that to continue, of course. In our forecast, there's really no way to anticipate droughts, so we'll adjust our forecast as needed over time. But you can see here that utilization rates are pretty low for Latin American LNG import terminals, usually below 25%, a quarter of their actual capacity. Again, Brazil has the most regasification capacity, 9 import terminals, more than half of the region's regas capacity. Mexico is second place. There's 4 import terminals, but again, cross-border pipelines mean that they don't need to use those terminals as much, and some of them are switching over to exports. And we'll get into that in a second. So that's the snapshot of the now. In the future, though, however, there are still some proposed LNG import projects across the market. There are 2 under construction right now. There's one in Nicaragua, which has been from New Fortress Energy, and that's just been delayed for various reasons, but it's still there and could potentially begin imports. There's a project under construction in the Dominican Republic on the north shore of the island near the border with Haiti, where there's a lot of maquiladoras and a lot of factories and industrial demand. We're tracking proposed LNG import projects in 3 markets right now. Colombia, of course, short on gas, and as Kenna mentioned earlier, record imports. They're seeking to build perhaps as many as 3 import terminals, 2 in La Guajira, I believe, and then 1 on the west coast in Buenaventura. We're tracking a proposed LNG import project in Honduras. And of course, we're keeping a close eye on things in Ecuador, where a historic drought led to blackouts, and they've started to import LNG via truck from Peru, from the small scale liquefaction plants. But and they're using power barges off the coast. But we're thinking with all the legal reforms that the government in Ecuador enacted, they've made it easier to import LNG. So we think it's only a matter of time before Ecuador, maybe gets an FSRU of its own or something like that. And then all over the region, there's a lot of small scale imports going on, ISO containers, barges, trucks in places like Ecuador, the Caribbean islands. There's potential to perhaps even expand to other markets like in Guatemala or Costa Rica. So now we'll just take a look at exports. Current liquefaction capacity in Latin America is 20.9 MTPA. Of course, you see Trinidad and Tobago with the most liquefaction capacity. Peru, as Kenna mentioned earlier, Mexico is now an exporter. There are 2 projects that we list under construction. One in Mexico, Energía Costa Azul, with Sempra's project in Baja California, south of Tijuana. And then, of course, Kenna also mentioned the Southern Energy Project in Argentina, which reached FID in May and is expected to begin exports in 2027. It'll be seasonal. It'll begin with seasonal exports in the Southern Hemisphere winter. Oh, I'm sorry. No. I mean, the Southern Hemisphere summer. With seasonal exports, and then kind of eventually as gas production in Argentina is able to meet domestic demands, perhaps we could begin to see year-round LNG exports from the project. That we're tracking several proposed export projects in places like Mexico, Argentina, Suriname, and Guyana. So again, we track liquefaction capacity versus the actual volumes that are produced, and you can see here that there's always a lag. So the blue up there is the LNG plants, what they can make. The orange is what they actually made or what they're forecast to make. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Plants don't always run at full capacity. In a lot of places too, like Trinidad and Tobago, there's declining feed gas reserves. So I believe one train there has been kind of mothballed until they find more feed gas for the plant. Trinidad and Tobago is working on a large number of offshore projects, companies like BP and Shell, et cetera. They're developing offshore natural gas fields that will be able to supply the LNG plant, and perhaps we'll be able to adjust our forecasts once we get more of a handle on how much of that gas will make it to the LNG plant versus other demand centers, other projects in Trinidad and Tobago. So still, just like I mentioned earlier, proposed LNG export projects. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll skip that one. Yes, this slide right here. No, we were talking about proposed LNG export projects in Mexico. Just taking a look at the country right now. If you look for there's one LNG export project in operation in Altamira. There's one under construction in Baja California. You look at these red squares here. These are the proposed ones throughout the country. Something about 44 MTPAs worth of proposed projects, and so not all the export projects will reach FID. There's a global competition for contracts. It's not just Mexico, but elsewhere. You have to secure feed gas for your projects. One of the things about Mexico is that the places where the pipelines go don't always overlap or neatly align with where the LNG projects are. And so you need feed gas, no LNG. but also increasingly in places like Mexico and elsewhere in the market, there's an increase of competition for molecules. Just because you have a pipeline doesn't mean that the capacity will be available for LNG. The rise of nearshoring, data centers, maquiladoras in Mexico, that all, and then the development of something like 12 new natural gas fired power plants. That's all competing for molecules with LNG in places like Mexico. So yeah, in many cases, some projects may have to even build their own new pipelines, as we've seen, if they want to guarantee feed gas for their projects, or do perhaps like compression and expansion projects on existing pipelines, just to ensure there's enough molecules for those LNG exports. So like I mentioned earlier, all of this, like the LNG market in Latin America is evolving. So I always like to say, and I've said this at previous conferences with Kenna, is that small is the new big in Latin America. This kind of concept that LNG in the Latin American market needs to grow incrementally, like in steps. Traditionally, across the globe, you see these big LNG export projects supported by 20-year, 15-year long-term contracts for large volumes, 1 MTPA, 2 MTPA. That's not necessarily the case in Latin America. Like if you remember from earlier, we talked about like how individual per capita power consumption is much, much lower in these countries. So that means overall, there's not quite the demand for power generation. It is growing in the market, but not at the scale to support signing large long-term contracts with LNG producers in the United States and elsewhere. So again, small is the new big. These things need to happen incrementally in steps. If you look at all the LNG contracts in our database from Latin America, they're typically smaller than 1 MTPA. We'll see 0.7, 0.8, 0.75, 0.4 MTPA per year. And you need those long-term contracts, creditworthy counterparties, and a lot of the LNG buyers in Latin America aren't always able to buy long-term like that or large volumes. You see chunky incremental demands, but where you really see like a lot of fascinating growth is in this small scale market, both in terms of production and demand. I always say that small is the new big. You see a lot of small scale LNG liquefaction plants in places like Mexico and Brazil and Peru, and they're doing good business. They're putting LNG on ISO containers and in tanker trucks, and over time a little adds up to a lot. And all these LNG trucks on the road from these small scale plants, over time they'll equal a full MTPA on their own. If you just make like something like 164 deliveries a day, you're moving the equivalent of 1 MTPA's worth of LNG. So small scale imports are, in my view, like a path to growing the market. That's tanker trucks, ISO containers, small scale containers. A lot of people are looking at LNG bunkering. Remember we mentioned those low utilization rates at some of the import terminals? Well, some of the import terminals are looking at LNG bunkering as a way to kind of grow those utilization rates at the import terminals. Again, like small is the new big. So like advantages, you can still get a premium on natural gas prices, meaning that you can charge the end customer. You can still make a premium on the natural gas versus what you bought it for from the U.S. or other suppliers. So you can still make a premium on that. You're expanding the customer base for LNG. The disadvantages here, we're talking about small volumes and very price sensitive customers. If diesel's cheaper, propane or something else, another fuel, literally these customers in Latin America will just switch and go to the cheaper fuel. There are very few long-term buyers in Latin America, even for these small scale LNG products. It's A long-term contract to them is 2 to 3 years instead. So that's one of the disadvantages there. But like, so as promised, we wanted to give you a look at the LNG prices in Latin America. And you can see here, like over time, these are for spot cargoes. What are Latin American buyers paying for their spot cargoes? Poten and Partners, we do keep track of the tenders, of all the bilateral deals in the market, and over time I put this together, and it shows like the lowest price ever paid in Latin America was Mexico in July of 2019, $4.10 per MMBTU, cheap. That I believe that cargo came from Corpus Christi LNG, didn't have very far to go to Altamira. The most highest price ever paid on record for us that we've seen in Latin America was in October 2021, kind of the events leading up to the Russia-Ukraine invasion. $37 per MMBTU paid by Argentina. Remember, Argentina has to compete with Europe during the Southern Hemisphere winter, and back then TTF prices and were very high, and so Argentina had to compete with European buyers at the time. Kind of right now, where we're at now is around this kind of $13, $12, $14 range. That's what most Latin American buyers are paying right now for their spot cargoes. So it's a good idea when you're talking about the Latin American market to keep tabs of the U.S. LNG prices, the liquefaction fees, and right now they had been rising above $2.50. Lately, we're seeing that fall slightly with some of the newer contracts coming out, but yeah, 250 or higher is kind of where things are headed. Above 250 due to like rising EPC costs, inflation, labor, tariffs, everything. You can still get discounts below 250 if you're an equity buyer, equity off-taker in a project. If you're buying large volumes, if you have really good credit that carries the rest of the buyers, there are discounts available for U.S. LNG volumes on a long-term basis. Some LNG buyers and long-term buyers in Latin America have their contracts on the Brent crude oil index, and we had seen Brent crude oil slopes, the percentages falling, but lately they've been rising again as oil prices have gone lower. You see the percentages getting higher. So that's a trend, and we're watching the competition between Henry Hub and Brent crude oil. Over time, one gets cheaper, the other gets higher, and we'll see how that plays out in the market. Just basically, again, just in this final, the evolving market, there's just all these wild cards. You have an increased competition for molecules, again, onshoring, nearshoring data centers, power demand. In Latin America, you need to build pipelines and infrastructure, just pipelines, processing plants, truck racks. You need to deploy ISO containers, small-scale ships. And just like everywhere else in the world, Latin America is facing inflation, increased costs, skilled labor shortage, and then there's always just like things like the weather affecting the markets. A drought means more LNG will need to be imported. A lot of price sensitive customers, contracting risk, not a lot of long-term buyers. And so, yeah, just again, wrapping it up real quick, we expect Latin America to remain a net LNG importer. That could change if enough projects in Mexico and Argentina reach FID. We expect Brazil to remain the largest importer. There's lots of industrial and power demand there. There's the promise of data centers. And then, as Brazil's market continues to evolve too, there's lots of downstream trading and opportunities there. Overall, remember that those low utilization rates at the LNG import terminals, a lot of those import terminals are looking at ways to boost those rates, those low utilization rates. There's ISO containers, tanker trucks, bunkering, and all kinds of small scale projects. During the last conference with Kenna in Panama, we got to see firsthand at how AES in Panama has like truck racks installed at their import terminal, and then Tropigas will come and take the tanker trucks worth of LNG, and then they'll they'll take it to a customer, like an industrial customer or a remote customer, and deliver that LNG to be used as like either power generation fuel or for like a furnace or things like that, industrial demand. It was really great to see. And then again, like perfect transition because small is the new big. Growth of small scale, very important in the market. Increased distribution of LNG. And again, that contracting risk. Not everyone's willing to like sign long-term contracts. So, and I think we'll just leave it there, Kenna. What do you say? And then we'll just start Q&A.
Yes, Sergio. Let's start with the Q&A. Here it is. We have already some of the questions there. Ok. Bueno, aquí tenemos varias preguntas, Sergio. Les invitamos a los participantes a enviarnos sus preguntas. Aquí Katia que nos apoye con las preguntas que ya han hecho anteriormente, pero si agarramos aquí las primeras preguntas, podías ver vamos a agarrar acá,
Bien, acá tengo una ya lista.
dígalo.
De Cristóbal Fernández Salgado. What about the new projects in Buenaventura Port in the Pacific Coast of Colombia? Thank you so much.
Creo que lo mencionó, cuando lo habían hecho la pregunta, no había todavía, Sergio ha hecho no lo había mencionado, pero cuando él hizo la pregunta, Sergio la respondió después, pero creo que estaba preguntando, cuando estabas hablando de los proyectos de GNL, preguntaron precisamente por el de Buenaventura, Sergio.
Sí, claro. Okay. Yeah. So the thing with Buenaventura, this is like the third time the project's been proposed, I guess you could say. The first two times were not successful. They're there again trying to and kind of reimagining it a little bit. It's not the same proposed project as the last time, but the need is there. Obviously, there's growing energy demand in the west coast of Colombia. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the gas is not located in the places where it's needed, but that project has been particularly difficult because of the mountainous terrain and the pipeline. You would need a downstream pipeline to get it to a power plant or to other demand centers from the coast. It's been challenging. It's proposed again. This is its third time, and we'll see how it plays out. I'm looking forward to the conference in Lima because I know we'll get more updates there.
Yes. Mira, se repite una pregunta, ya la han hecho varios participantes, y es relacionada con los proyectos de Ecuador. Aquí en la más reciente, can you share more about Ecuadorian market? There are a growing need for natural gas, que la hemos visto recientemente, and current imports are insufficient. You mentioned a terminal project. What stage is in it?
Okay, yeah, this is more of an idea because than an actual project, and I'm glad you asked about this. But it's one that I'm watching closely because the drought was a wake up call for Ecuador. There were blackouts all over the country, and there were government reforms passed to make natural gas a lot easier to import. If anybody wants a copy, I could send them the whole law. I have a copy of the approved law that they did to make natural gas imports easier. Right now, the front runners of all this are the small scale liquefaction plants in Peru. They load up LNG in ISO containers and they truck it across the border. They didn't have procedures or paperwork before, so I remember like Sidecar. When they did their first one, there was a little delay with the paperwork because this had never been done before, customs wise. How do you clear a truck like this to cross the border? Well, they finally figured it out and they got it. And what you see is a lot of small, like in places like Guayaquil. That's an important population center in Ecuador and an industrial center. And what you're seeing there, and there's also shrimp farms too. Shrimp farms are big customers of small scale LNG in Ecuador. What you see there is just deliveries being made and then the LNG being used for these, these customers. Right now, Though, however, overall in the long term, I think like Kenna mentioned, and it was very important about how natural gas LNG is used to shoulder um, power demand during droughts. I think Ecuador is going to have to do the same. They were able to kind of patchwork together some things, and luckily, the rains came back and hydropower came back. But I think overall it was a wake up call. And so you have something like 3 power barges deployed off the coast of the country, and those are just temporary solutions. So they're making electricity offshore and just kind of, sending it in to the coast. But overall, I think you're going to need to see at least one FSRU. How much utilization it gets, that remains to be seen. But yeah, I think there's definitely room for Ecuador to become an LNG importer. And the reforms that the government enacted have paved the way, but there isn't yet a proposed import project. No developers come forward yet, but given these reforms, it's only a matter of time.
Sí, y añadiéndole allí, ha avanzado más en los términos, como lo has mencionado, en small scale, con ahora el anuncio de la empresa Lipiandes comprando a Sicar, que es el que tiene los proyectos de small scale. Y bueno, esto significaría de repente más inversiones en este sentido y potencialmente crecer el negocio de pequeña escala con GNL en el Ecuador. Avanzando aquí, bueno, hacemos trampa con los últimos que están escribiendo, pero aquí Andrés pregunta, él es de Etapro, dice, how LNG facilities in Latam are currently implementing digital strategies and enhanced operational. Oh, está muy complejo, creo yo que son preguntas técnicas sobre enhanced operation and using reliability and efficiency. Es como más preguntas técnicas. No sé si sabes algo de esto.
I think we'll save that one for the conference. I know Mehdi and some other people have some smart
exacto,
answers for that. Yeah.
Andrés, estas son preguntas más técnicas, las podemos responder durante la conferencia.
Pendiente.
Pendiente, claro que sí. Andrés que va a participar, claro.
Que venga, Lima.
Sí, ya lo invitamos, ya Andrés ya está invitado. A Lorena, is there a web page or database of companies that are investing in LNG projects in Latam? Lorena, puedes bajar el Factbook que tenemos completamente gratuito y puedes tener una buena referencia de cuáles son los proyectos que están actualmente operativos, inclusive los cancelados y los planificados están en esa edición. Una nueva edición va a ser lanzada durante la conferencia de la edición 2025. A ver, otra pregunta. Nuestro amigo Oscar Santibáñez, dice, how realistic is the price offered by Ecopetrol LNG regasify at Buga using FSU in Buenaventura, Barge Island, ISOs, Transportation and Regas Facilities? Un poquito compleja. Yo no tengo datos sobre el precio de Ecopetrol. ¿Tú, Sergio?
Yeah, no, cuando anduvimos ahí en Barranquilla, la cuna de Shakira, ¿no? When we were there in Barranquilla, we did get an update about I believe he's asking about the offshore import project that Ecopetrol is proposing. Yeah, there's 2 on the Caribbean side, the Atlantic side of Colombia. There's 2 proposed LNG import terminals, both in La Guajira, and there's one onshore one that's proposed, but he's talking about the Ecopetrol one, which is kind of exciting and kind of an easy one because it used to be an offshore natural gas platform, and so it's just sitting there. You could just reconfigure it to import gas. There's already a pipeline that'll send the gas to the population center on the shore. So very interesting project, very interesting proposal. And yeah, you would need kind of like an FSU to kind of pump the LNG to the platform where it's regasified and then sent via that subsea pipeline. On the surface, it seems like a practical and cheap solution to kind of narrow that supply gap for Colombia. Interestingly enough, the Ecopetrol and Petrobras and all these other kind of multinationals are also looking at offshore exploration and production in Colombia. So this solution would be kind of like maybe perhaps like a temporary stopgap. I mean, we're years away from these offshore discoveries of natural gas off the coast of Colombia yielding actual molecules. So this would be a nice, effective kind of temporary solution, low cost that would provide gas in the meantime until that other fields can come into production.
Ok, moviéndonos a una pregunta de Rodrigo Sánchez, él pregunta más hacia las áreas de Guyana y Surinam. Exxon tiene dos planes de LNG export plans en Georgetown, en Barbies. En Surinam, la extracción aún no se inicia, serán diferentes players. Ah, si ves factible un terminal de GNL que condense a ambos lugares, o podría darse en múltiples proyectos. ¿Qué información tienes? Bueno, en este año Wilson firmó un estudio en Surinam para desarrollar una unidad flotante, así que Surinam está allí avanzando. Am, Fíjate, yo pienso que Surinam avanza de manera exploratoria principalmente y en materia regulatoria. Yo creo que hasta que la parte regulatoria no esté completamente definida, ahí estaremos todavía en veremos, pero no sé qué piensas con relación a estos proyectos de Surinam y Guyana.
Yeah, I mean, there's gas there. How much gas can be used for LNG will remain to be seen. That's why they're doing the study and everything. And you know, you have multinational companies there involved also that could bring their own FLNG ships that are already built or charter a new one. So yeah, that'll be something to watch. And I need to go back. I was just thinking about Buenaventura that Oscar was asking about. I was thinking that like maybe the solution there isn't like a traditional LNG import terminal. Maybe it's one of those where you import it and then you put it in ISO containers and trucks and then get it on the roads to places where it needs to go. Maybe you don't build that pipeline. You never know with what the proposals will come out for Buenaventura. It could be a reimagining of the project. We'll see.
Ok, aquí nos acompaña el capitán William Rincón. Saludos, capitán. De la terminal SPEC LNG, tiene un comentario general que dice, de acuerdo con las normas internacionales, la industria de GNL, todos los proyectos deben cumplir con los estándares y las buenas prácticas de la industria de GNL y garantizar la seguridad de las operaciones, salvaguardando como primera medida la vida humana. Y eso no se da solo con autorizarlos. Se debe observar la viabilidad desde un punto de vista técnico profesional, ciertamente, claro, es uno de los componentes fundamentales para el desarrollo de proyectos. La pregunta que hace el capitán William ¿es posible lograr obtener un mapa de las fuentes en Latinoamérica de GNL para pequeña escala, bunker, fuentes de llenado de isotanques? Eso nos lo han pedido mucho, no lo hemos trabajado. Yo trabajo con lo de las terminales a gran escala, las terminales que reciben a través de buques, pero bueno, en GNL Global estamos trabajando porque de verdad que hay un mercado muy extenso en lo que es pequeña y mediana escala, que ya se refiere más al mercado doméstico que no lo hemos trabajado como en mapa. De hecho, cuando a veces lanzo el mapa de las terminales, los de pequeña y mediana escala dicen, no estamos ahí. Pero pronto, yo creo que pronto es un buen trabajo que podemos hacer en colaboración, Sergio, yo creo. No sé si ustedes lo tienen en Poten.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I might steal that idea. Yeah, it sounds like a good idea to me.
Porque hay muchas empresas que son de pequeña y mediana escala que obviamente no están reflejadas casi o sea, en un directorio. Nosotros nos lo han pedido mucho, pero sí, es un proyecto que podemos desarrollar. A ver, ¿quién más? Aquí Carlos Calvo. En su forecast está incluido el proyecto de regasificación de empresa Amazónica LNG en Colombia. Entendemos, está muy adelantado. Yo vi a los amigos de Amazónica en Colombia, pero no conversé con ninguno de ellos, no tengo
No,
contacto con ninguno de ellos.
yo tampoco, pero pendiente.
Pónganse en contacto para registrarlo. ¿Quién más? Aquí. Iván nos pregunta por acá en el forecast, ¿qué porcentaje del consumo global en Latam se piensa que puede cubrir las exportaciones de GNL en los próximos 5 o 10 años por vaca muerta desde Argentina? ¿Qué porcentaje del consumo global en Latam, o sea, del consumo de las importaciones de GNL de América Latina, se piensa puede cubrir las exportaciones de GNL de los próximos 5 o 10 años de Argentina? O sea, Argentina como exportador, ¿cuánto podría cubrir? Bueno, eso es muy relativo. Eso va un poco en el trabajo que haga Argentina en el tema de comercialización, en el trabajo que pueda ofrecer diferente a los proveedores actuales. Actualmente, fíjense, la demanda o las importaciones el año pasado fueron 15 millones de toneladas, 15,6 millones de toneladas, una cifra que aumentó 33% con relación al 2023. ¿Cuánto de esto puede aportar Argentina con sus proyectos? No, no, no podría decir, eso tiene que ver con el departamento comercial, o sea, de ser un buen proveedor, proporcionar buenos contratos, buenos precios. ah, eh, Habría que verlo. ¿Qué dice Sergio? ¿Cuánto puede vender Argentina en la región?
Oh, like how much volumes will be sold into Latin America?
Yes.
Oh, well, I mean, you can expect like these portfolio players, like trading firms, multinational, operating in the region. Like, let's say the big companies like Shell or whoever else, you would expect them to be like, let's say they become an off taker, they finalize those agreements and become an off taker in Argentina. Yeah, you could easily see Argentina,
Oh,
Shell already shows that flexibility in the market. Let's say let's take Shell has the contract with El Salvador, right? So you see volumes from Shell's portfolio from places like Nigeria. They mostly come from Trinidad and Tobago, but you'll see the volumes from Elba Island in the U.S. or Nigeria coming to places like El Salvador. I think you could expect the same. If someone like that is an off taker in Argentina, you can easily see them using their portfolio to sell to other customers in places like El Salvador or say Dominican Republic, where Shell is building an import terminal or planning to build an import terminal, I should say, or just going to the Brazilian market, or even in places like Colombia where they do bilateral trades. It just depends who the off takers are going to be. If they matches up, then yes, you could easily see some of these cargoes going to other destinations in Latin America. But I don't know that you'll get like an off taker from inside Latin America, say, like I don't know if any Latin American buyers will sign up for Argentina. Well, we'll see. You never know.
sí, por eso, depende mucho del departamento comercial. Lo que sí es muy claro que el GNL argentino, si quiere competir en la región, tiene que competir con Estados Unidos, con los cargamentos de Estados Unidos y con los cargamentos de Trinidad y Tobago. Desde que Estados Unidos comenzó las exportaciones en 2016, desplaza a Trinidad en el 2018 como el principal suplidor de GNL. O sea que realmente Trinidad ahí ha batallado porque el GNL de Estados Unidos ha desplazado los volúmenes de Trinidad. Nosotros hemos hecho análisis de que el GNL trinitario ha tenido que ir más hacia Europa, más hacia inclusive otros destinos, cuando antes del 2018 era el principal suplidor. Al margen de los problemas técnicos que ha tenido con los trenes en Trinidad, sigue supliendo el 30% del GNL que consume América Latina. Definitivamente Argentina tendrá que ver estos nuevos proyectos o sea, que sus principales consumidores en términos de región va a ser principalmente los Estados Unidos. A ver, otra pregunta por acá de Andrés Pernica. No sé cuánto más tiempo tiene, Sergio, nos podemos quedar unos 10 minutos más. ¿O tienes tiempo para seguir con síguele aquí, esto está
Sí,
de
claro, unos dos más y ya.
la pregunta.
Estamos bien,
Mira,
estamos
aquí
bien.
Andrés pregunta, ¿podría repetir a qué volumen anual GNL se refiere cuando habla de small scale liquefaction? Eso es una pregunta para ti, Sergio.
Sí, bueno, lo que refiero es más o menos lo que hemos visto como 100,000 galones por día, like 100,000 gallons per day to like 300,000 gallons per day. Like there's a monster small scale LNG plant in Brazil. I think Eneva launched it earlier this year. 300,000 gallons per day. That sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to MTPA, it's definitely far less than 1 MTPA. But still, it's very meaningful. I mean, these are stranded natural gas resources that are now being able to be monetized and put to good use by end customers. And again, like the adoption of natural gas and LNG in Latin America, it needs to happen in those incremental steps. And you see that in Peru, something like plants with like 120,000, 160,000 gallons per day. You know, then you got to do the math to convert how many cubic feet per day of gas that is. You know, it's small, but it's meaningful and it's incremental. It can grow the market.
Vicente nos pregunta qué proyectos se ven en Guatemala para la próxima licitación de energía eléctrica.
Right. Oh yeah, that was an exciting announcement they made at the last conference we were at in Panama, and there's room for LNG imports in Guatemala, but again, it's not these long-term big, you know, imports. Like you're not going to see 1 MTPA or anything like that. You'll probably see like ISO containers or tanker trucks coming from Mexico or something like that along the lines. Yeah, regionally.
Fíjate, yo este año tuve la oportunidad de reunirme con representantes de Guatemala que ciertamente están muy claros con la licitación de energía eléctrica, pero no están muy claros con el tema del desarrollo y obviamente tienen que darse muchas bases allí para atraer a un desarrollador de una terminal. Sigue en discusión, los invitamos al evento porque potencialmente ahí pueden ver a los proveedores, pueden eventualmente ver empresas interesadas que decidan, dependiendo de la demanda de estas plantas que se están visualizando, de repente desarrollar un proyecto en Guatemala. Honduras va un poco más adelantada, ya tiene una unidad flotante firmada, pero Guatemala todavía tiene que trabajar un poco en el tema del desarrollo de la terminal. Vamos a ver acá, ya vamos a ir cerrando con las últimas preguntas, Sergio. Ok, para ver. Bueno, aquí hay una de Renzo Castillo. ¿Qué perspectiva tienen de Perú con la planta Perú LNG y los futuros proyectos de importación?
Well, we'll certainly know more after the tour for the GNL forum when we get there. But what I love about Peru LNG is that there's two things that are kind of important for me. Of course, you know, production at the plant has been stable over time. It's one of those that performs well. The utilization rate of the liquefaction plant, so it's beautiful how closely it mirrors its capacity. And after the Russia-Ukraine, you saw its importance increase even more with cargoes going to Europe. But there's two things going on there that I kind of like. They've added truck racks to the LNG plant. So, you know, LNG trucks can come and pull up, and then from there they just fan out into the countryside of Peru, delivering natural gas to a growing number of customers. So that's a way to grow demand and satisfy domestic demand, you know, because you know the exports are one thing, but then you need to satisfy your own domestic market. So they're doing that at Peru LNG, which is great. And then there's that proposal with the Japanese off-takers to do CO2 carbon capture to make synthetic natural gas, and then, you know, carbon-free LNG. So that's going to be a really that project is dependent on a lot of things and reaching FID and subsidies from the Japanese government, et cetera. But or tax credits or whatever, not subsidies per se, but yeah, that's going to be a one to watch in Peru. You know, I believe it'll be the world's first such project if it reaches FID and moves forward. So.
Bueno, aquí la última pregunta es de Carlos Núñez. Carlos, saludos a Carlos. Tenemos la pregunta es, ¿por qué existe tanta diferencia en los precios de importación de GNL que se mencionaron? ¿Cuáles son los factores que influyen en estas variaciones?
Oh, so on that slide earlier, why the big? Well, it's just spot market prices, and a lot of it has to do with seasonality too, when you're trying to buy it. You know, and the source of the origin. Obviously, after Russia-Ukraine, prices got a lot higher, and so Latin American buyers had to compete directly with with European buyers European buyers, you know, with the loss of Russian gas supplies, were willing to pay a very high premium. So Latin American buyers had to compete with those prices. And so typically for you know, buyers in, like, say, places like Brazil and Argentina during the southern hemisphere winter, that's the northern hemisphere summer, when demand is not quite as high as, say, the winter. So that kind of offsets prices, but doesn't mean that they're going to be low per se, in some years. I would say that overall, the best hedge against this volatility in spot cargo prices are long-term contracts, but not everyone is willing to sign them. So,
No,
but
pero
yeah, it's kind of crazy, right, to see the wild
pero
variability in
también,
prices.
también es una de las limitantes que tiene la región, debido a que es muy estacional el consumo. No muchos, ¿sabes? Están willing to sign the contract with so irregular demand. Es más factible cuando tienes un cliente que te va a consumir siempre lo mismo, pero aquí varía demasiado. Aquí vemos volúmenes récord en Colombia, y es porque no llueve, pero inmediatamente empieza a llover, ya de repente el GNL ya no va a cumplir no va a cubrir la misma necesidad, porque entra en la hídrica a cubrir. Entonces, es una de las limitaciones que tiene el mercado de América Latina para hacer contratos a largo plazo. Bueno, ya con esto, de verdad que te damos muchas gracias a todos los participantes, damos gracias a Sergio por esta presentación. Los invitamos a seguirnos, los invitamos también al quinto Foro Internacional GNL Global, que este año lo vamos a celebrar en Lima, 13, 14 y 15 de octubre. Vamos a estar visitando la planta Perú LNG el día 13. Los invitamos a inscribirse y a tener la posibilidad de ver esta instalación increíble, la primera en Sudamérica a gran escala, que este año cumple sus 15 años de operaciones. También vamos a estar hablando de la terminal de Puerto Rico, que este año cumple 25 años. Es la primera terminal de GNL de América Latina y el Caribe. Arrancó en el año 2000 y que este año cumple 25 años. Así que vamos a tener un representante explicándonos cómo ha cambiado el rumbo de Puerto Rico con esos 25 años de esa terminal, que ha pasado hasta huracanes y todas las temporadas, y sigue dando energía segura a la isla. Nuevamente, muchas gracias a todos. Gracias, Sergio. Gracias a Poten Partner. Y los vemos en una nueva edición. Ya será para el foro en Lima. Sergio.
Gracias. No, gracias a todos. Nos vemos en Lima, ¿eh? Nos vemos todos. Gracias.
Nos vemos. Chao.